Hi everyone, welcome to part two of Mark and James talking about our problematic bands and artists. Thank you to everybody who tuned in for part one. So just a quick recap, we are counting up, not counting down, counting up towards our number one most problematic artist or band. So these are not necessarily acts that we despise. They are just bands or artists that we've always had a troubled relationship with. It might be that we like part of their catalogue, but overall we're not big fans. But we are working up towards a kind of top spot where we're going to finally hit pay dirt in terms of talking about a particular band or artist that we've really never got on well with at all. Okay, so we're going to start off then with my number five. Now, of all the artists we've talked about, this is the one that I'm most kind of uncomfortable with, and that's because the band in question is very well respected, very well regarded, and very influential. So here we go.
Oh, no. You built this up now. Oh, this is a bit edgy.
Yeah. So this is why I said I felt a bit uncomfortable. So Joy Division, okay. Yeah, I'm not going to say too much about this. I mean, this is a great album. The Martin Hannett production, it's got a very kind of icy cold sound. It's very kind of mysterious. It's very enigmatic, beautifully done. And it's clearly got a lot of artistic intent behind it. Like I said, the issue I've got with it, it's a little bit like the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band record. I've always kind of bracketed these two records kind of in a similar way. And I don't really want to listen to that one very often either. It's kind of, it's not a record that I'll put on with a beer on a Saturday night and kind of enjoy it. It's more like, right, I'm gonna go into this place now, into this quite dark place. But it's important that music does that. I don't think music should just be entertaining. It shouldn't just be something which allows you to feel good about yourself. It should challenge you. It should scare you. It should, give you a different perspective on things. And that's why I am uncomfortable putting this in the list. So I'm putting it in the list as a problematic band for me. I prefer New Order. I get a different vibe off their music, where the melancholy and the sadness is still in there, but it's kind of wrapped up more in something which I want to listen to. I've never yet ever listened to this record and thought to myself, I can't wait to listen to that again. My mind understands the quality, but my heart doesn't necessarily kind of embrace it. I find it hard to relate to it. I think the darkness and the and the coldness of it. Actually, most of the time I use music to kind of warm myself up. I often think of the metaphor of walking into a room and lighting a fire in the grate. You spark up a fire in order to warm the room up, in order to turn the room into a pleasant place to be. And I often use music in the same way. If I come in to a cold room and I'll put some music on to warm the place up, and I wouldn't do that with that record. I wouldn't reach this one. So yeah, but I'm not dissing Joy Division at all. Clearly a fantastic band. Right, done.
Just what last word on that? The difficult Joy Division. I love Joy Division, but I don't listen to them very often. They're not a band I think that you can listen to every day. Or I might listen to their albums maybe not even once a year. Quite often, listen to a few tracks, but to go through a whole album does actually take. A bit like Radiohead, actually. It sort of does take sort of commitment sometimes. When you listen to it, though, even now, Joy Division just sounds like nothing else. It just kind of blows me away when you listen to that music. It just sounds like it's from another planet. It's just crazy, right?
It's kind of a bit like modern classical music, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to listen to Penderecki's Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima every day, but when you do listen to it, clearly it's a very singular kind of work of art, really. So I'm putting it in the list not as a meh band, MEH, more as a problematic kind of record for me. So I just need to perhaps do some more work on it. From there on, we're kind of a bit more plain sailing. We're a bit more I thought it'd be more interesting to talk about that, for example, than to talk about say Bon Jovi. It doesn't really take me very long to explain what I don't like about Bon Jovi. I just can't stand Bon Jovi, Whereas I thought that would be a bit more of an interesting conversation. So anyway,
absolutely.
Right.
Right then. So
Good stuff.
I've seen your Joy Division.
Yeah.
I'll raise you a Rolling Stones.
Okay. Right. So that's your
My
number
number
5.
5.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Rolling Stones again. You know, obviously hugely influential, sort of great rock and roll band, still going. I think,
Mhm.
as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Again, played Glasgow not so long ago.
Yeah.
Did that an hour set or whatever it is, and but yeah, they just again, this just never clicked for me.
Mm.
I liked some of the early stuff. I've never listened to a Rolling Stones album. I've heard obviously lots of tracks and stuff of theirs, and I've listened to bits and bobs of stuff. I've never actually sit down and listened to a Rolling Stones album at all, ever.
Interesting.
And it's not something that really appeals to me at all. You know, there's some classic records in there, obviously, but I think it's sort of there's a particular type of rock, sort of blues rock, and sort of that kind of thing, which I don't really like. I mean, I don't dislike it, but it doesn't really kind of do it for me. And obviously, that's kind of their meat and bones, isn't it? And it's not something which really, you know, appeals to that whole kind of genre of music. Sort of stuff, you know, it's just
Yeah, I mean, I guess your tastes are probably a bit more kind of European, aren't they, in general?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I never really, you know, when people kind of play the blues and stuff like that, and it just leaves me cold, really. Blues and soul leaves me cold, weirdly enough.
I was just going to say that the Stones don't just do the blues; they do the soul as well. But if you don't like the soul either, then you're kind of in trouble.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they do country as well. They do country.
Oh, I hate country completely.
Yeah,
So.
you're sort of talking about Americana, aren't you? Really, you're talking about the kind of Americana, American music.
I was just looking at my iTunes. I've got Aftermath, I've got Beggar's Banquet, and I've got Sticky Fingers on my iTunes.
Right.
Like, I haven't listened to any of them.
It's quite funny because my dad, you know, when I was growing up, my dad's a bit like you. His tastes are very European, so he liked the Beatles. He could hear something in the Beatles, and I grew up. You know, my dad didn't have many pop records, but he did have, you know, he did have the Beatles in his collection, and I could hear what he liked in that. But the Stones, he's never understood any aspect of them at all. He just I think he literally hears it as a noise. It doesn't tick any of his boxes because his ear is far more European.
Yeah.
So
sounds about.
Yeah. Brilliant. Right. Okay. Should we move on, or is that enough on the Stones?
No, that's good. Let's move on. Rolling Stone, God, there's no more.
Number 4, I nearly put them at number 1, and I've lifted them a bit, and hopefully I can explain why.
Oh, okay.
Oasis.
Yeah.
Now, once again, we can talk about the cult of personality, Liam Gallagher, Noel Gallagher, the whole kind of soap opera aspect. Really good album. Not quite my bag, really, but you know, you can sort of listen to this and think, yeah, this kind of sums up. I mean, what was it, 94? Yeah, I mean, I've got this memory of sitting in the Royal Park pub in Leeds and seeing them on the TV jukebox doing one of the kind of early songs. I think it was Cigarettes and Alcohol, and it was immediately evident that this was a band that was going places. You couldn't deny that. It was kind of like, wow, they've got the image, they've got these kind of very hooky, very, very direct songs, which clearly were going to be really popular, really big, you know. They made this record, which is kind of, it is sort of a British classic, really. But the record I really like by them, I don't have, and that's the second one. Now, most people put this one at the top of the list, and they put What's the Story, Morning Glory second, but I prefer that one because, well, for a start, they changed drummer, and they got this guy in, Alan White, who was the brother of Paul Weller's drummer, Steve White, and his drumming was fantastic. He had a kind of jazzy touch, which was fairly, well, it was not what you'd expect in a rock band of that kind, for example. So if you listen to Wonderwall, he's playing with these kind of softer sticks, and he's doing all these lovely kind of floaty fills, you know. It was really interesting sound. And the sound on that record, it's much more kind of 1967. It sounds almost a bit like The Summer of Love, or, you know, it's got a Beatlesy to it. You know, songs like She's Electric could almost have been on Sgt. Pepper in a way. It sounds a bit like a Paul McCartney song.
Well, it's got that ending as well, hasn't it? Which is basically ripped off
Yeah,
Little
well,
Help from
from my friends.
Friends. Yeah,
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And there's some great songs on that record. You know, there's Some Might Say, there's Champagne Supernova, you know, really, really great songs. But didn't they bloody nosedive straight after that, though?
Mm.
And then what they did was, they made two cardinal mistakes. First of all, totally nosedive artistically, and then just keep thumping it out then for years. So
Nosediving into pain as well, I
just
think.
nosediving and nosediving and nosediving, just making album after album of increasingly kind of turgid, whiny, annoying, generic, derivative bollocks. I mean, I saw them live in a dreadful, it was a kind of ice rink in somewhere, some place, and God, they were so dour. They were kind of like hacking away at their instruments. They kind of walked on stage looking like, if you imagine like in the freezing depths of winter, and it's like a motorway that needs some like work doing to it, and these workmen arrive in order to dig up the road in the depths of winter, and they get out of the van and they start setting up the pneumatic drills. You know, if you imagine that scene, if you imagine the expressions on their faces and just their
Yeah,
general demeanor, that was Oasis that night. It was just like,
deep disinterest. Was
yeah.
that towards their sort of time then? Because they pretty much gave up, didn't they?
What do you mean?
Well, you know, the last couple of years, they weren't interested, were they? They just went through the motions, I think.
I don't know. I mean, they had a huge amount of problems behind the scenes. I think Liam and Noel were very, you know, were fighting a lot. So yeah, they just ended up winding me up because it was just more of the same, more of the same. And now in retrospect, they are kind of held up as this great classic British band. And I kind of think, yeah, if they packed in after that second album, fair enough, but they dragged on. I mean, they've got their solo careers now, and I actually don't mind the stuff that I've heard. You know, Noel Gallagher's solo stuff is all right. And even Liam Gallagher, actually, he's kind of come out of the woodwork as a kind of reasonable songwriter. But I still, when I hear those songs now, when I hear the new stuff, it just gives me a slightly unpleasant flashback of the second half of the 90s and beyond, going into the noughties, and just more crap Oasis songs on the radio that I didn't want to hear. And of course, constantly on the radio. That was the thing, wasn't it? A bit like I was talking about Radiohead and, you know, whatever, just, you know, Manic Street Preachers or whatever, just being banged over the head with it constantly. And in the end, you just end up...
Wonderwall was never off the radio, was it? For months, for a whole year, I think it was just on every day.
Yeah,
I remember.
Yeah, and then you'd have like drunken students just sort of,
oh no,
you know, walking through town and just singing it, and yeah. I just don't think they were as good as people made them out to be. I don't think Noel Gallagher was as good as people make him out to be. His guitar solos are dull, and Liam Gallagher's, you know, people say that he's got this great stage presence because he just kind of stands there with his hands behind his back, but it sort of works sometimes. You think, yeah, this guy's got something, he's got a kind of magnetic presence, but other times you just look at him and you just think, oh, pull your socks up, lad, you know. And a bit like I was saying about, you know, bands that come on wearing baggy cardigans, bands that come on wearing anoraks. Pop music does exist in its time, so I think if you're going to judge Oasis, you'd have to look at them as, you know, the influence they had at the time, and you can't really argue with that. I mean, that guitar sound, which they stole from Teenage Fanclub, but they did sort of make it their own. It did become the defining guitar sound of British rock music, didn't it? And it was a really powerful sound too. It was full on. It wasn't kind of half baked. They really decided to kind of, it was like they took the Stone Roses idea and just stuck a rocket up its backside and just made it like 50 times bigger and bolder and more kind of just in your face. So I can definitely see how it would have been very exciting to have seen them in their heyday, maybe just after this record when they were just about to, you know, perhaps at Nebworth, for example. I think it would have been a good experience to see them. You know, we can kind of celebrate them and look back and go, wow, look at that. That was, you know, the whole Britpop thing, but they transcended it. I mean, they were sort of briefly in competition with Blur, weren't they? But then they just absolutely knocked Blur out of the ballpark. I mean, you're talking like just they totally smashed them.
Although Blur did continue to make better records in some respects. All right then.
Yeah.
Where are we? Number 4. So I've got number 4, Led Zeppelin.
Right. I suspected you might have them in, but I wasn't
Yeah.
entirely sure. Right. Okay. Okay.
So again, not a band that I particularly dislike, apart from obviously Stairway to Heaven, which I find you don't actually hear it much on the radio, thankfully these days. But I don't know, when I was growing up, it seemed to be on the radio all the time. It
Hmm.
just goes on forever.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, I imagine they don't even like it either. But that's a record that kind of just annoys me now. But a
Mm.
lot of their stuff, again, like a lot of the sort of artists we're talking about here, there's some great stuff in there, and I really enjoy, a lot of the work that they've done. But I wouldn't listen to an album of theirs at
Mm.
all.
Mm.
And it's again, it's that rock thing,
Mm.
drum solos, guitar solos, screaming, which doesn't really kind of do it for me
Have
at all.
you heard the song No Quarter, which is on Houses of the Holy?
I've no idea. I might have done.
I think you might like that one. It was written by John Paul Jones, the keyboard player,
Mm.
and it has a lot of very, very atmospheric, really great kind of organ playing in it. It's really kind of eerie.
Mm.
It's not like anything else they ever did. It was quite keyboard led and quite spooky
Yeah.
sounding and quite kind of interesting.
Mm.
So I would recommend that track
Yeah.
as one, which is maybe not what you think of being, the classic Led Zeppelin, the kind of shrieking and the guitars and all that. It's like a mood piece, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some stuff there. And like I say, I do like some of the. I've got a sort of best of on the iTunes, which I never listen to. My mum loves them. My mum loves rock and roll. You see, so I kind of get a bit of that from her. She loves Queen,
Yeah.
Status Quo, Zeppelin, early Beatles before they went a bit weird. No, she likes the Rolling Stones as well, so she loves all that stuff.
Mm.
And Rod Stewart. But yeah, it's not something I particularly sort of like. As a, I like a lot of rock stuff, but I don't like.
Mm.
In the same way, if you like, it's sort of a purity of the genre. I think, like Kraftwerk for me is like the purity of electronic music.
Yeah.
So even though a lot of their stuff is quite kind of weird and abstract, and people wouldn't necessarily listen to like 20 minutes of Autobahn, which I love from beginning to end.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing with things like Led Zeppelin, because people who like that sort of music must absolutely love Led Zeppelin, because it's kind of like a distillation of all that's great about that style of music, which is just something I just don't really like, really.
Yeah, they were sort of like the logical. Well, they were more than the logical culmination. They were a kind of. It was a culmination of what had been happening in the late '60s, because you had Cream and Hendrix and the Yardbirds, of course, which is the band that Jimmy Page had been in. And I think the idea was to sort of take this music and go, look, we just need to take this music to the furthest kind of point we can, and just turn it into something much more extreme and much more, find the furthest expression of it that we can find. So it was just, let's just get these guitars, which are already really wild and really exciting, and just make them as so wild and exciting that nobody will ever make them any more wild and exciting than that. And let's get this drummer to do a drum sound and style which nobody will ever be able to rival. So much so that anytime anybody wants to get like a really amazing drum loop on a hip hop record, they won't go anywhere else other than John Bonham, because he had the greatest acoustic drum sound that was ever recorded on When the Levee Breaks on Led Zeppelin 4, where they put his drums in a stairwell in this big crumbling mansion and just recorded him, and the sound just went all the way up the stairwell, and it was just like cannons at the end of the world, And so many drummers since then have tried to get the Bonham sound, and none of them can come close, really, because they don't have his technique as a drummer, but they also don't have Jimmy Page's engineering skills, because he was a great engineer. He knew all about microphone placement. He was a great kind of master at acoustic, recording acoustic sounds. He knew how to get a good sound, and those records are technically brilliant. But none of that means anything if you don't enjoy the music. It's kind of like, well,
It's a bit like Kraftwerk. People have tried to do Kraftwerk, but no one can quite do it. They've got a particular sound,
Yeah.
which they've created, and no one's been able to replicate that ever, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite neat thing. There was just one story with Led Zeppelin. I remember years ago, again, some house party somewhere, they'd put on Led Zeppelin, and everyone was like, you know, talking about how great it is and stuff. And I was just sat there slightly bemused, probably a bit drunk. There's one bit, I have no idea what track it is, but it's quite this long, sort of laborious drum solo.
Yeah.
And I sort of described it as like, it sounds like he's falling down the stairs.
He probably was falling down the stairs.
I thought, really? I was probably very disingenuous, but you know.
Well, you know, you're saying that you find Stairway to Heaven really tedious.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to feel sorry for the drummer, back in those days you couldn't drop in, so they did a complete take of it, because John Bonham doesn't come in till about halfway through, so you get this really long extended, you know, introduction, and then you get several verses of the song, and it gradually builds, and finally John Bonham comes in, and so John Bonham would have to wait. He'd have to sit there and wait for his moment to come, and then he'd, you know, do the thing. And he'd done what he thought was the best take that he could do. And Jimmy Page said in the control room afterwards, he thought, I think he can do one better than that. He said it's good, but it just needs to be one notch better. And he really wasn't happy. He was like, oh, fuck, I've got to sit there again for another 5 minutes listening to Stairway to Heaven before I can come in, you know. So he sort of went back in there, like, you know, cursing and muttering, like, right, this is the one. And he kind of sat down, and they had to start the song again from the beginning, and he had to sit there and wait again, you know, for his big moment. And that's why when he does come in finally on that, which is the take which they finally used on Led Zeppelin 4, when he comes in, he really bloody comes in. He comes in with like this immense, just
I'm doing this again.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is the one. I'm not doing it again, you know. And I love that story because it really demonstrates Jimmy Page's good judgment, because we don't know what that first take was, but we do know what the second take was. And when you listen to it, Jimmy Page was happy with that one. And you can really imagine John Bonham at the end of it going, right, yeah, you bastard, you were right. There was another take. And you know, and that was it. So, but a very, very overplayed song. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I still enjoy it. I still like it. Okay, good. Shall I move on to my number 3?
Yeah, let's get to the top 3. This is what gets interesting.
So again, I move these around, and again, this person could have gone at number 1, and he still could. On a different day, I'd have done it differently. He's at number 3, and he is Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, Brucey.
Yeah, and again, you know, this is about me. It's not about Bruce. Bruce is a fine songwriter. There's been many occasions, actually, when I have turned him off on the radio. And it's quite rare that I'll do that. You know, I don't turn music off that often. It's got to be like a really terrible kind of pop hit. The kind of thing that you hear coming on, like, oh, I'm not listening to that again. I'll turn that kind of stuff off. Most music that I don't kind of like as such just washes over me. I'm quite happy just to listen to it and just get it over with and hope that the next song is better. But there's something about Springsteen when he's in his full chest beating mode, when he's doing all that bellowing and that kind of grandstanding. I just go, oh, off. That's the reaction. It's something about it. It's that visceral thing again. And I'm not even going to say, okay, so because Springsteen did other things other than that. He did like more kind of low key stuff and more atmospheric stuff. But unfortunately, I've never been able to bring myself to listen to any of it, because I've got this kind of backstory now with Springsteen where he's turned into this kind of like bête noire figure that I just think, oh, I go back to that phrase, that kind of self-aggrandizing thing. And I don't even know if that's a fair accusation, because is he doing that? Is he self-aggrandizing himself?
I don't think he is. I think he sees himself as I mean, he's very, you know, he's very, very kind of modest, you know. I think he's obviously like the voice of the American working class, isn't he? That's always been his thing. Yeah, I think he has quite a humble background, and I think he's always sort of had that. And again, he could have been on my list, to be honest, but I didn't even think about Bruce Springsteen. It's not even on my register, really.
I thought you were about to start defending him. I thought you were about to just reveal that you're a secret fan.
No, not. But I think, yeah, I don't think you can accuse him of being like sort of pompous and overblown, because I don't think that's really his thing. I
No.
think you could misinterpret that potentially, because what he does is very passionate and very from
Yeah.
the heart. Everything that he does is like, you know, he doesn't do anything, you know, sort of half baked. Everything
I
has
think you're right. Actually, I think you're right. He's projecting something, isn't he? He's not necessarily projecting himself. He's projecting an image of something which his audience recognizes as themselves.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and that's a really unique gift to have. Well, not a unique gift, but it's a very special gift to have. The ability to show your audience something of themselves and blow it up into just on a massive scale. So you kind of dramatize their lives, and you dramatize their struggles and their dreams, and you give voice to their deepest yearnings. And even as I'm talking, I'm kind of talking myself into liking Bruce Springsteen.
But then you go listen to it, it's really sort of dull, droll music. It just
Yeah, I do like a few of his songs. I like Dancing in the Dark, although it has the worst drum sound, one of the worst drum sounds ever. It's that horrible gated drum sound.
He played Glastonbury not so long ago.
Yeah.
I watched the first 10 minutes. God, it was dull. You know, he started the set playing like new songs that no one knew, and he just like did that for about an hour, and then another 2 hours doing other stuff. It's just like, how long does this go on for?
I was surprised watching him that his band, they seemed like a classic kind of white man's rock band. You know, like his concept of white rock music. It's like music, like rock music, which has become somehow divorced from its kind of black R&B thing. And they played a Chuck Berry song called "You Never Can Tell," and I was actually quite surprised at how little they seemed to have kind of grasped the feel or the groove of that song. You know, how you'd play it so that you'd turn it into something that you could dance to, because that was the original idea of, you know, R&B music. So you'd have an artist like Chuck Berry, they'd play a song and the audience would be dancing, they'd be moving around to it. And the way that his band played it, it was like starting from the drum rhythm, you know, the way the drummer was using his right foot, it was, they totally stripped it of all its kind of like dance music, party music thing, and turned it into this kind of white man's rock song. It was just, it was a rock song for punching the air to.
Yes.
And it really surprised me, because at the time I was playing in a shitty little band in Lancaster, and we were doing a good little version of it, and people would be dancing on the tables to our version of it. And I was listening to Bruce Springsteen's version of it and thinking nobody would dance to that. You'd punch the air to it, but you wouldn't dance to it.
I don't think Bruce Springsteen's an artist you could accuse of making music you can dance to, I don't think. Right then, number 3. Now, this might upset a few people. And I need to tailor this with 2 very specific things, which have not turned me against this band, but kind of just fed up of hearing about them constantly. One of those things is Six Music, and they are particularly to blame for this, because they talk about this band constantly, and they go on and on and on about them, and they'll play them at any drop of a hat, really. And they'll kind of, if they're talking about music, they'll kind of shoehorn this band into it so they can play a track by them.
Okay.
And it just really annoys me. And that band is The Clash.
Ah, okay.
So obviously they're massively influential and a really important band. That kind of combination of music they put together, you know, at the time. And you know, when you listen back now, it still sounds good. You know, you know, there's some great stuff, and you can, you know, really enjoy it. I know, you know, Clash fans are legion, aren't they, throughout the world. But I'm just so fed up with hearing them. And again, it's purely down to Six Music. Well, Six Music's one thing, and the other thing was that advert with "Should I Stay or Should I Go" on it, which is on TV constantly for about 2 years. And that song is pretty bad. I don't think even Clash fans like that song. And that was on, and that really put me off them as well, because it got released as a single that it used to do, and that was in the charts and it was on all the time. So it's just that, really. You know, I like the Clash, and I like sort of big Audio Dynamite, sort of grew up with all that stuff. But I'm just so fed up of it now. I think, you know, in the same way, you know, like Joy Division, if you like, or Sex Pistols, you just hear these bands and these names over and over and over again, like nothing else existed before them. and it just winds me up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this problem is only going to get worse, isn't it? It's like you were talking about
Mm,
Oasis, and we were talking about, were they the last great British band?
mm,
Unfortunately, because of the way the record industry has been kind of dismantled and taken apart, and nobody is now willing to invest any money in any new things, really seriously.
mm,
Bands like The Clash and Oasis, unfortunately, they will just keep being extolled, or they'll keep being foregrounded as time goes on. Their legend will just continue to grow, won't it? So you
especially
won't
when the
stop hearing The Clash. There won't be another Clash to replace The Clash. So therefore,
no,
you'll have to just keep listening to The Clash.
yeah.
That's kind of the
When the
unfortunate.
band members die as well, that only gets worse, doesn't it? Really,
Yeah.
it's just relentless, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, I mean, I read a book about the Clash recently, a really good book. It was called Passion is a Fashion by Pat
Mm,
Gilbert. Great book, because I didn't know much about them really, and I was
mm,
impressed by how kind of how much integrity they had.
mm,
They really went to town, like trying to like meet their fans and just be good to their fans, and
mm,
they were quite humble people that they sort of kept living in squats and terrible flats, long after they were kind of touring America and having this big kind of profile. Really interesting book, and the dynamic between Mick Jones and Joe Strummer, this kind of
mm,
creative tussle. There was all sorts of interesting stuff that I didn't kind of realize about them really, because you just
mm,
sort of think of them as being this punk band that made a few albums and then disbanded, but they've actually got this quite long tortuous history, a bit
mm,
like any other band, like the Beatles or Queen or whatever. Quite a lot of stuff happened to them
mm.
just in the short amount of time that they were together, and they made such a big impact.
They did, yeah. I mean,
Massive
they're a big
in America,
melting,
particularly.
yeah, they're a big melting pot, that band, really. Just like punk and rock and reggae and ska and everything, really. It's kind of all in there as part of their
Yeah.
part of their sound, which is, I can really appreciate that.
Well,
But
I mean,
like,
they did more than any other band probably to bring that kind of reggae influence kind of
yes,
mainstream. And it's quite ironic because when you look at if you tune into certain, say, North American YouTube music channels where people are talking about the Clash, they will often, they like London Calling, but they don't like combat rock so much, and they usually will end up
right,
saying it's because they don't really like the reggae dub reggae thing. It
okay,
would be nice if they just carried on making rock music. And
mm,
you kind of think, yeah, you've not really understood the Clash, have you? It's almost like
no,
they've got the picture, yeah, the Clash were just another rock band. And I think
yeah,
it's really
not
important
at all.
to the Clash themselves that they were not just another rock band. It's quite funny, they really, really hated the Police, the band, the Police,
Right, yes,
because they saw them as just absolutely, they had nothing, they had no true connection to like reggae music or Jamaican
mm,
music. They just used it as a kind of, as a pop gimmick, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
Let's just do some reggae type music and we'll tap into this thing. Whereas for the Clash, I mean, they kind of like, they really hung out with sound system guys, and they went to
mm,
Jamaica and almost got killed there. It was like a
yeah,
way of life for them.
oh
And
yeah, 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 absolutely, yeah,
good
yeah.
choice. Interesting.
Cool. Mm.
Clash.
Right then, number two.
Okay. So the big two at number two, appropriately enough, is the band U2.
You too.
U2.
Ah, interesting.
U2.
I
Now,
never. Mm.
go on. You start.
Well, again, it never even occurred to me to pick that band because they're just so far off my radar that
Okay.
I didn't even consider them. Yeah.
I thought I'd have to include them for the simple reason that they're such a huge part of the landscape. I mean, we talk about bands like Bon Jovi and Guns N' Roses, and they were never really contenders for me because I don't know, they're big, but they're not kind of like that big. U2 are so massive. There's an inverse ratio thing. It's like the amount that I'm interested in them compared to how massive they are, it's like a real kind of discrepancy. You think a band that big, you think I'd have more of their records, or I'd know more about
Mm.
them, because I'm such a music fan,
Mm.
obsessed with music, just never think about anything else. What went wrong with me and U2? It's not as if I have a definite specific aversion to them. Yes, there's the Bono thing, cult of personality. Let's get
Yeah.
back to that. He is or has been quite an annoying person over the years,
Mm.
starting with the dreadful mullet at Live Aid,
Mm.
and
That's
the
unforgivable, isn't it? Really.
yeah, I never really forgave him for that mullet. But there were
Mm.
lots of other people had bad mullets. McCartney had bad mullets.
Mm-hmm.
Can't really hold that against him. But what can I say? I just never got into them. I had friends at sixth form college who got the Joshua Tree, and they would extol its virtues to me and say, this is a fantastic album, you must listen to it. And I just never did. Never bought it, never listened to it. I've still never heard it. Have you heard it?
No, I was, again, I think it was a documentary. I think, it was another BBC4 documentary about Brian Eno, because obviously he produced that.
Yeah.
So I thought, I never really kind of sort of clocked that, to be honest. So I might go and give it a listen, because I really like Brian Eno.
Yeah.
Especially his production work. But I never got around to listening to it. Never quite made that leap.
It's odd. I mean, for me, I've always, my main basic creed is always to kind of check out stuff. You know, if there's a big significant record, it's very rare that I won't check it out. So something clearly has gone badly wrong between me and U2 somewhere down the line, where I've got to the age of nearly 50 as an obsessive music fan, and yet I've never heard this album, which is like one of the defining albums of the rock era, arguably. You know, you talk about Dark Side of the Moon, you talk about Sgt. Pepper, you talk about the Joshua Tree. They're kind of like, you know,
absolutely.
Why the bloody hell? And I sometimes think it's just stubbornness on my part. It's just that at some point down the line, I've just decided I don't like U2, and I think Bono is a bit of a twat, and I'm not going to listen to the Joshua Tree. That's kind of why they're in the list, really, rather than me kind of saying, oh, I hate U2 or U2 are crap. It's more just this thing. I've got to put them in because they're such a huge part of the musical scenery, and yet I've interacted and connected with them so little. I mean, it's not too late. It could still happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
I think, for me, it's always The Edge, just because of that name and the fact that he was very anti-technology, sort of anti-synths and drum machines and stuff.
Ah, right.
He always talked about his guitar playing as being like this kind of, amazing piece of musical genius, which is just going diggy 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 as far as I could hear.
One of the things I always find about his playing is that it's very instantly recognizable. It's also very influential. There's so many bands, I'm talking Coldplay, these bands that have a lot of reverb, but when you actually get inside the reverb and listen to what's going on, there's not a great deal going on. It's just some guy, or whatever. Kind of quite straightforward stuff. But there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mind simplicity in music, but it does seem like he went down that avenue of like, let's get all these effects pedals and let's like craft a studio sound, which is going to be my sound. It's going to be the Edge sound. And that's what I'm known for. But, David Gilmour did that. He had his own little rig. He set himself up and made himself sound like David Gilmour, and then continued sounding like David Gilmour for decades. And that's what musicians do. They find a sound, don't they? And the Edge's sound was so influential. So many... I think because it was a technologically aided sound, ironically, even though he claimed to be anti-synthesizers or whatever, his sound was so kind of like, effects pedal laden. Technologically enhanced guitar, wasn't it? That's what led to their longevity, because they came up in the 80s, just when things were starting to move into a technological era, and they were able to just ride that, really.
They did have their dance phase, though, didn't they? Like TV Zoo and stuff. A couple of albums, which I actually quite like, where they did sort of ditch the guitars a bit and get keyboards and drum machines and that kind of thing. And that was quite interesting stuff. And obviously they went off that pretty quick and went back to the sort of rock and roll, whatever. The only track I really like of U2 is Where the Streets Have No Name. Okay. I thought that was a really good track. It's quite poppy, and it's quite interesting that that's the one that the Pet Shop Boys decided to cover. I think that sort of speaks volumes about not just them, but my taste of music and that kind of pop sensibility. To the Pet Shop Boys to kind of pick that track out, and for me to kind of like that track, I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it is kind of something which is something that's there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's
weird, isn't it? When you look back over your life, you ask yourself, why is it sometimes it's like that Radiohead thing again. You sort of go to this incredible gig, and for some reason you don't follow it up, or you really enjoy a particular record, but then you don't get the next one by that band.
Yeah.
And it's like a parallel universe where I really became massively into Radiohead, and I got really into U2, and for some reason neither of those things happened. One thing I'll say just before we finish with U2, Bono's voice does annoy me.
Yeah.
That's one thing that can't be overstated. And I was talking about this with Radiohead too. Sometimes you can boil it down. If you analyze, you think, why did I not become a fan of this band? Sometimes you can actually realize there's a specific thing. And for me, oddly enough, it usually is the vocalist. There's something about the vocalist, either his personality or her personality or the sound of the voice. And sometimes I can be listening to a U2 song, and because I don't know their music, I don't know it's U2. So it'll come on the radio, and some of their more recent stuff, to my ears, sounds like quite kind of annoying pop music.
Yeah,
I don't know what period it's from, but it's like a while ago, like most bands of their age, they start making music which is trying to get on radio too. So it sounds a bit like annoying. Like Richard Ashcroft has done that from The Verve. You know, he now makes annoying pop music to get on radio too, doesn't he?
Yes, pretty much.
Quite kind of shallow, synthetic sounding pop music with a kind of really annoying hook. And I can hear a U2 song not knowing it's them, and something is annoying me. Usually that kind of music will just wash over me. I'm driving, whatever. I'm not listening to it. There's something about this song which is annoying me. And then gradually it sort of percolates up into my conscious mind. What is it? It's the singer's voice. There's something about this voice. And gradually I'm thinking, it sounds a bit like Bono, this. And my first thought sometimes is this a band that's trying to be U2? And sometimes it takes me a while to go, actually, is it U2? And then it comes on, and that was U2's latest single. And I'm like, that's why I've been getting a bit tense driving along.
Talking of which, number 2.
Yeah.
We're back to Oasis again.
Oh, right. Okay, so good. Right.
I put them higher. My relationship with Oasis is very, very on-off.
Yeah.
When I first heard, again, this is because I was working at Virgin at the time when they were kind of breaking through. So obviously they were on the sort of install radio thing constantly, and everyone I worked with and everyone who bought records, again, just like piles and piles of records. They just bought everything, and they were always there. They're on the radio, they're on the TV. It was very hard to avoid them. So when I first heard them, actually, I thought they were awful. I thought, God, what's this? Because again, at the time, sort of mid '90s, I was getting quite heavily into sort of rave stuff and sort of techno.
Well, yeah, I was too. I mean, Oasis
just seemed like complete, kind of rewind from all that stuff, and it was like just as music was getting interesting, here come along a band with like just guitars and just plodding along, making this kind of racket. But then I really got into them, with Morning Glory. I really got into that record. And I kind of got swept along with the whole Britpop stuff and all that kind of Blue Oasis and Sleeper and Elastico and all those bands. And I listened to them quite a lot, And obviously, when the third album came out, that was the end of that. That was kind of a brief sort of thing with Oasis. I bought one single. I only ever bought one thing of theirs, which was Whatever, like a one-off single. It wasn't on an album, so it was just that. Very Beatles. I think at the time, again, I was just sort of getting into the Beatles too, sort of coincidentally. And but then they got sued, didn't they, by Neil Innes for ripping off
Ripples.
No, the Idiot song.
Oh right, okay.
It's basically the same vocal melody. This is probably why I liked it, because I liked sort of the Bonzo stuff and Neil Innes and that kind of stuff. Monty Python, obviously. So subconsciously in my head, I sort of recognised this tune already. That's probably why I liked it.
I didn't hear about that. I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Obviously, the Noel Gallagher stuff, obviously he did the Chemical Brothers. So there is that crossover. He talked about the sort of the dance stuff that he always talked about doing. So obviously he did Setting Sun on Dig Your Own Hole.
Great track. Great album.
Let Forever Be on that single. So he's done a couple of, he's done some interesting stuff with like interesting bands, and I'm fine listening to that because I think they kind of destroy his vocals quite well on those records.
Yeah.
And I think a bit like James Dean Bradfield when he kind of does sort of guest stuff. I quite like the stuff that they do when they do guest stuff.
Yeah.
But as a thing in themselves, as like sort of the pure sort of Oasis thing, I don't really want to hear it ever again, to be honest.
No.
Just
it's played out, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was played out by the early well, even by the late 90s, it was played out.
Yeah, yeah,
They had their time, they had their moment. They should have been a bit cannier about it and got out. I mean, the two guys that left the band, they actually said that, you know, Bonehead and the other guy, the bass player, they always said that they wanted to actually disband after the Nebworth show. If they jacked it in after that second album, I think they would have a much more solid reputation, I think. Which is what U2 have still not done. I didn't mention that, actually. I mean, my final choice, which I'll talk about in a minute, they did finally also call it a day. And I think it's important for bands to call it a day in the end. And U2, for whatever reason, I'm not saying that they should call it a day, because I don't know them. I mean, they might still feel in their hearts that they've still got another 50 great albums inside them. So who am I to kind of, pass judgment there? But, you've got to be skeptical after a certain point. I think particularly when a band have become so massive, just this idea that you can just carry on forever. Is it problematic? I don't know. I mean, U2 are still massive and they're still, but then you get to the point where you're having to give away copies of your record. You're having to
God, no one wants
time to call it a day, I don't know. Right, if I do my number one.
Yes, let's go for it.
Okay, so I started the episode with a very well-respected band who have a lot of artistic credibility and who are treated very seriously by critics and by their fans too. And I'm going to end my list with a very similar kind of band. Been around for donkey's years. They don't exist anymore. This is a bit like the U2 thing in that they were so huge and they were around for so long during the period when I was so heavily into music that it's kind of like makes me wonder what on earth happened really between me and
REM. Oh, interesting.
REM, yeah. Now again, if we were going to talk about Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses, so we're not in the same ballpark really. I absolutely acknowledge their songwriting prowess, their originality, their influence, massively influential, and also a really cool band in the sense that they were a kind of very sort of underground college rock kind of band that somehow managed to cross over into the mainstream in the most spectacular way and turned something which had been very cult and very cool into something which incredibly was still almost cult and cool, but also massive.
Yeah.
It's quite a difficult trick to pull off.
Yeah, absolutely. And still retain that kind of credibility as well.
Still retain the credibility, still have all that respect. Now, REM, they kind of drove me up the wall in the 90s in the same way that a fair few of these bands that we talked about did. When Out of Time broke, you couldn't escape Shiny Happy People, Losing My Religion. I mean, you go to the pub on a Saturday night for a few drinks with your mates and you had to endure the sight of Michael Stipe on that screen in the corner doing that thing, Losing My Religion, that video for that. That video alone was enough to make me hate REM at the time. I'm not convinced I hate them anymore, but at the time it was like, I'm so sick of the sight of that guy on the floor pretending that he's some fucked up kind of lost soul.
Yeah.
That's fairly shallow criticism on my part because, the guy's entitled to be unhappy if he is unhappy. I never knew whether it was a pose or whether he was genuinely as interesting and as introspective as he was making himself out to be, or whether it was all part of the package. It was all carefully thought through, going to be this kind of introverted, messed up sort of individual. And it was the era of Kurt Cobain. It was the era of Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. It was that era, wasn't it? Where you had to be kind of messed up and a bit fucked up and a bit emotionally, whatever. I don't know. And it got rammed down my throat. And that was it. Just never got into REM. But again, with Bono, same as with Bono, the voice. And I was listening to it today and his voice was annoying me. What he does is he sings in these very long kind of legato lines where he stretches the phrases out rather than doing it in a kind of rhythmical or syncopated style. And at some point during that, he'll hit this frequency in his voice, a certain frequency that just it goes through me. I'm just like, cut the note short, Right. And he also does this thing that annoys me, where he does this slight falsetto thing at the start of a phrase, like that.
Yeah,
I find it annoying.
Those early albums before certainly before Document and Out of Time. Part of the enigma of REM was the fact that you couldn't quite hear what he was singing. So you listen to those albums and you kind of go, what's he singing about? What's he singing about? And obviously we had no internet then. There was no lyrics. So the only way you could kind of figure out what the music was about was really listening hard to it. Right. I think a lot of people quite got into that kind of trying to decode what was going on there, because his vocal's quite low down in the mix, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite swampy, you know.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's never particularly persuaded me, really. I mean, it's very easy to be obscure and very easy to be indecipherable. I mean, all you really have to do is just mix the vocal down a little bit under the guitars, and any band. I mean, if you mix Bon Jovi underneath the guitar, then you won't be able to understand what he's saying. And then does he then become really enigmatic and really interesting? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, they did go. They did go from that to being him, up front, didn't they? I think quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like the fact that he's mixed low. I mean, when it really starts to drive me mad is in the kind of Out of Time era, because they became such a big band that they had to buy into that thing where a hit record has to have the voice kind of like turned way up right at the front.
Yeah.
So then you get songs like Everybody Hurts, and just, those tracks where it's like, it turns into the Michael Stipe show, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my number one choice isn't a band, it is a person.
Yeah, I think it's going to be.
I say a singer loosely.
Yeah. Harmonica player?
Could possibly be. I might upset a few people here.
I saw this one come in a mile off.
Did you?
Because I used to listen to his CDs in the house that we shared together, and I've got a memory. And you came home because your bedroom was underneath mine, and you came clumping up the stairs, and you kind of shouted up the stairs something like, "What's that fucking shit?" Go on, man.
That's usually my reaction to this particular artist, who of course is Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's going to upset a lot of people, because Bob Dylan is someone who's revered very highly. He's a Nobel Prize award winner, singer, artist, harmonica player, poet, etc., etc.
I don't think he won a Nobel Prize for his harmonica playing.
No, that was purely for his lyrics, wasn't it? I think. Yeah. Even then, he was very disingenuous about that, wasn't he? This is another thing about Bob Dylan. Is his character. Mm-hmm. I was very dubious about this, about whether that's a deliberate thing, where he's deliberately obtuse, or whether he is just like that. Or whether, I can never quite figure that out. Mm-hmm. And that's just one of many things that just annoys me about Bob Dylan. Mainly his voice, which I just can't stand. It famously said his songs are better sung by somebody else, which quite often they are. His voice, his harmonica, and they just go on. I remember in the car once, there was a Dylan track came on. I thought, oh, God, Dylan, turned it off, and like 5 minutes later, put the radio back on, he's still going, God, it's still going on, like turn it off again. And like, okay, he must be over by now. It's like verse 24. So, oh my God.
Yeah, some of the stuff recently has been he's got into doing these songs where it's the same tune
all the way
26 verses.
Yeah, no chorus, just verse after verse after verse after verse after verse, which is just it's just relentless. And again, the subject matter that he sings about again just doesn't really chime with me at all. And there's some great songs in there. I hear them on the radio. Sometimes I can listen to it. It's okay. Sometimes not. He's an interesting character. I do enjoy sort of listening about him and hearing him talk and stuff and things like that. And I sort of watched a documentary about him. Again, another BBC4 one a while ago. And I love the stuff where he that famous gig of his where the first half was acoustic doing his folk stuff, and the second half he comes on, it's all electric. And the audience were just apoplectic of just hated him. They hated him, and I hated it. And he was like a Judas, I think they called him. He even hates his own audience. You got it. I know, and that's kind of him, really, isn't it? He's kind of I don't know. It's just bizarre.
It's interesting because you mentioned you were talking about the Clash earlier. And I was reading about the Clash, and so I was listening to their music while I was reading this book, and I listened to the Clash quite a lot for a week or two, and then for some reason I listened to a Dylan album, and it was one of the ones from the kind of late 70s, I think. It was one of the, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was a live album, and I heard it and I thought, actually, Dylan is quite like the Clash, and the Clash loved Bob Dylan.
Right.
He sort of was a punk rocker. If you sort of go back to the 70s and
Mm.
kind of late 60s, he did have that confrontational attitude. He wasn't really
Yeah.
there to entertain people. He was there to do his thing. You could like it or
Mm.
lump it. It was quite abrasive. It could be quite ugly. It could be quite, it was kind of passionate and real, and kind of, it was what he was going to do. And there was
Mm.
always going to be people who didn't like it. That was kind of like, that was sort of the point of him.
That's the point, yeah.
Yeah, if Dylan had been somebody that everybody was going to like, that wouldn't have been Dylan, and it would have made him a lesser artist than he actually was, maybe, because he was the kind of voice that was going to turn people off.
I don't like bands purely on lyrics and vocals.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people got into like Dylan and the Smiths and people like that purely on the content of the lyrics and the message and the meaning behind that stuff. And that's something that's never really kind of been an important, for me, it's always the music first, and then, the lyrics and stuff after. So for Dylan, that's quite a problematic thing, because obviously the words and the message is like the most important thing, and the music is almost secondary, I think, to kind of Dylan to get the message across.
What's your take then on the songs of his that have been done by other people? Are there any songs by him that you kind of enjoy because they're done by someone else?
Well, William Shatner's version of Hey Tambourine, obviously up there is sort of the greatest cover version of all time. Yeah, I can't think, off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone who I like who's done a cover of Dylan, which probably says everything, really.
Right, okay, folks.
On that bombshell.
Yeah, we'll be back for more videos, hopefully, in the not too distant future, where we might actually talk about music that we like. We can just find something that we like.
Okay, all right then.
All right, folks, thanks for watching.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.